presentation. So our goal right now is simply the topic of eliminating EMT before paramedic. And what we're choosing to call this in Texas, where we're piloting it, is the open enrollment paramedic program. And I know that there is a lot of controversy behind this topic, and that's part of what we're going to kind of talk about today. So let's start with the polling questions. If you wouldn't mind, take a few minutes and answer the polling questions that you have in front of you. We'll just take a few seconds to see how quickly we can get some of these populated. Just give us your opinion on these topics. It's simple yes, no type questions. These are kind of fun to watch come in.
Yeah, they definitely are.
Yeah. There's little lines that go back and forth as far as where we are with questions. All right, so those are kind of interesting.
Yeah.
We got, is it 36 people we have logged on right now?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, and apparently there's a couple who aren't voting yet, but so they're interesting numbers. So that the first question, given an opportunity, would you offer a paramedic class that did not require EMT certification? Would that be of value to your community? 68% said that would, and 32% said it wouldn't be of value to their community. The question, is it essential in your mind that paramedic students be certified as EMTs before attempting paramedic school? Is exactly 50-50. That's an interesting one to me, because that's about what we're finding in Texas. There are people who love it and people who hate it, and there's no one in between. And we're at 50-50 with the same thing. Is it essential in your mind that paramedic students have experience as an EMT before attempting paramedic school? And then could you build a curriculum that encompasses all EMT skills within a paramedic program so that EMT certification was not a required prerequisite? 94% said you could, 6% said that they couldn't. So that's interesting. So it means that we could still build this, even though half the people still think that we need the experience and that you have to be an EMT first. And that's really what I'm going to try to change your mind, I think, or at least I hope. So interesting numbers and some good questions there. So let's move on to the topic. First of all, I want to just kind of give you some conflict disclaimer information that hopefully will kind of give you an idea of what I'm not trying to do. First of all, I am an active member of NAEMSE and have been for a long time. Believe in NAEMSE as really a good organization. I am their representative, one of two, to the board of directors for the Committee on Accreditation of EMS Professions. And I'm also an active member of the Texas Association of EMS Educators. My sole sources of income come from Weatherford College as a faculty member. I do get a small stipend from the COA when I review the ISSRs and CSSRs and help Dr. Hatch write the executive analysis. And when I say a small stipend, I can buy a pair of shoes at the end of the year. Things that we're really trying to not do is we're not trying to eliminate EMT certifications, and we're not trying to eliminate EMS courses. And I want to make that clear. In fact, I want to make it so clear that it really is kind of the next stop. We are not, as we look at the title of eliminating EMT before paramedic certification, we are not advocating, suggesting, recommending the elimination of EMT as a certification at all. And I also want to just kind of say we are not starting to talk about or stating that EMS education, or at least, sorry, EMT education has no value. And I know there are people out there that'll say, well, I'm an EMT instructor and you're telling me my courses don't matter. And that's not true. They do still matter. They have a place. That's what we want to look at, is where is the right place for some of this information. So let's look at what we are trying to do and where we are trying to go. The real question is EMT certification essential before you go to paramedic school? And this has been kind of the very burning question. Well, if I look at it in one sense, we know it is a state law, it's a rule, it's a regulation in, probably 60 of our 50 states. So everybody has that. We know it's in the National Registry process. And for those of you wondering what's happening there, I've been discussing with National Registry ways to fix that. It's just going to take a little time, but it is in the works. We also know it's tradition. We've always done it. And if we've always done it that way, we have to keep doing it that way. That's the way it is, right? And of course, this bottom bullet, I had to do it, so others should do it too. Those are all the tradition. That's the thing we've always done. So the question maybe isn't, is EMT certification essential? But should it be? Do we have to do it? If we have had a way around it, could we do it a little bit different? Over the years, we've come a long way. You know, in 1970, EMT school was really short. It was skill focused. And then paramedic school wasn't exactly long either. Now, my paramedic school was 144 hours. That was it. And I was a paramedic. We built on EMT a little bit. We still, and I think, I can't remember completely because it was a long time ago, but I still remember teaching traction splint or covering traction splinting and bandaging materials in paramedic school just to make sure we still remembered it. And that was all crammed into this 150-hour course. By 2000, the EMT curriculum had increased well over 120 hours. In a lot of states, it's over 200. Paramedic school is over 1,000 hours, in some places even more than that, some requiring associate degrees. So we've come a long way. And the big question is, in that time, do we focus enough in paramedic school that we didn't need that EMT certification to get there? Is there enough content that isn't necessarily an absolute anymore? Our traditional models of offering the EMS certification starts with completing an EMT course. So you take an EMT course, and I'm going to go with a college-based curriculum because that's what I know, and I know it varies depending on where you are. But let's just pretend it's a 16-week class. A week after class, I can take my national registry, and 1 to 3 weeks after that, I have a state certification. I can work as an EMT. Then we have this undefined level of experience, and it varies. There are states that require you to be 1 year, require you to have 500 calls. We sometimes in certain states define that, but in other states, we have no standard. In fact, in a lot of places, the very next thing you do in that undefined level of experience is enroll in paramedic school. So we had no experience at all, and the time frame was very limited. And then you go to complete a paramedic class, and this takes, depending on the program, I'm again going to focus more on a college-based curriculum. Others can do it quicker, but 40 to 64 weeks of paramedic school. When you're done with that, you have 1 to 2 weeks to take the national registry exam, 1 to 3 weeks of certification within your state. So we're looking somewhere at about 86 weeks of education to go from nothing to paramedic. And in some cases, maybe that's really a long time for somebody trying to become a paramedic. If we look at this from a standpoint of cost and effort, these are low-end Texas college numbers. I know there's other places that it costs almost $10,000 just to go to EMT school. So these numbers vary a little bit. But let's just kind of look at some basic ideas. It's a EMT class that costs $1,000, also has books, uniforms, screenings. There's an $80 national registry fee to get your state certification. And in Texas, it's $64, plus you have to pay for fingerprints. And the thing that bothers me about all this is if you are a tax-based entity sending someone, these are all tax-based funds. So this is my money paying for someone to get educated. We see a similar thing with paramedic. It's going to cost about $3,500 to go to paramedic school, and that's on a low end, plus books, uniforms, screenings. $125 to take the certification exam to be nationally registered, and then a little bit more for the fingerprinting, the state certification, whatever it takes to get certified in your state. And again, tax funded or tax based if you're with some city, county, state, municipal agency. So all that is stuff that we can take into the consideration and stuff that I think we need to think about. We also have some mindsets, and these are things that we have learned over the years and seen. So the first mindset is that EMTs leave school and find work as an EMT on an ambulance. Well, I don't know about your area, but we have so many places in my part of Texas that are not hiring EMTs. They only hire paramedics. So these EMTs can't find work in the first place. So that means the limited amount of students who find work are really a small number that's coming into the paramedic schools. We think EMTs gain experience from patient care, and maybe they do. But the big question is, what type of experience do they get? It's not always positive. They learn bad habits. Sometimes it's limited to the service they do. And if all they do is nursing home transfers, they may not be getting all the experience that we think they should be. We also know that basic experience is important to paramedic education. We know that, right? Well, we're finding that that's really not the case in every other profession. If basic experience is important to become a paramedic, isn't there something that says that, well, we should have a basic process before you become a doctor or a nurse? And we don't have that. So really, we are the only profession within the House of Medicine that has this lower level required before we go on to essentially where we want to be, which is to be paramedics. Every other profession trains to the end result, and that's something we need to think about. We also have the mindset that EMT-based knowledge adds to the paramedic education. Well, I've been an educator for a long time, and a lot of times these EMT levels of knowledge are not really what we expect them to be. Now, I know everyone on this call is doing really well in their EMT trainings, but somewhere we have to admit there's what we refer to as that lowest common denominator program. And let's just ignore them for a minute, but let's look at an EMT who comes out of school with an 80 average in EMT school. 80 is really good, low end of B. Good number, still means 20% of what they were supposed to know, they either learned wrong or didn't learn. I have to overcome that. Well, if that's one student, the other guy that got an 80 has 20% lack, it's probably not the same 20%. So now I have multiple things that we probably have to overcome. So I learned 10 years ago, I have to cover an entire EMT curriculum in the paramedic class or I've missed something. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind as we progress in the paramedic education. We think EMTs pose or have or possess, that should be a possess, and understand the anatomy and physiology and medical terminology. And this is an interesting thought and it works in some ways, but what I'm finding in my paramedic students who are all EMTs is that their level of anatomy and physiology, their knowledge of medical terminology is not really as good as we thought it was, even if they completed a college level medical terminology class. And I think those are things that we really have to consider as we're progressing through the paramedic school. So there's a lot of things that are important to think about. We had a question from Dustin that said, what about experience other than just clinical experience? Just learning to talk to patient is a tough skill to learn. I agree. There's an interesting thought with that. We have paramedic students who can't talk to patients because they do everything with texting. That's a big problem. I don't know that we look at what EMT school does. I'm not 100% sure what we see from the standpoint of their experience, how much talking they do. And that is something we can do. My question back to you is, can we not make that up in the paramedic education? And that's really kind of where we're going to go with that. So stay with me for a little bit and we'll kind of see if we can answer some of these questions at the end. We'll get a discussion going because I think these are good topics. So let's go with this concept of national registry. I always get a lot of comments from people telling me I'm not teaching the national registry curriculum. And I think, well, that's interesting because I've never seen a national registry curriculum. I also find it interesting that we tend to think that this national registry is this big thing up on the hill that, you know, it glows. National registry really isn't our target. National registry is not an indication of overall abilities. National registry doesn't really indicate success in all areas. It doesn't indicate the ability to perform EMS tasks, skills, or care for patients. When we look at national registry, this isn't the target. This is what we're trying to achieve. National registry really should be nothing but, if I can get the thing moved, there we go. It's nothing but our low bar. This is the least we will accept in our country. This is by definition the entry point. If you can pass this, you can participate in our profession. And if you can't, you can't. So this is the lowest level we accept. And I don't mean to say anything bad about national registry. It does a good job of establishing this bottom minimum layers. And I think that's the important thing. We have to shoot above this. People who think, well, I'm nationally registered. Well, that's wonderful. So is everyone else, except the people who didn't fail or didn't pass. So keep in mind that it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody did well. And I think as we look at schools, there are schools that still do less than 80% overall pass rates. Those schools, again, those lowest common denominator schools, are still sending EMTs to your paramedic programs. And these are things that we have to think about. How much effort did someone have to do to even get out of EMT school? And are they still ready for paramedic school? Because I find some national numbers really interesting. And as we look at the number of people who get certified in this country, we had in 2020, and these are all things, you can go to the National Registry website, go to the bottom of the page and hit maps and statistics and find all this stuff yourself. So this is all stuff off their website. We had 5,800,969 people certified in 2020. That's 84,000 and a little more that actually tried. So only 71% of those who attempted certification in 2020 got certified as EMTs. And that's over all attempts. So that's 3 people out of every 10 that graduated a program and said, you're ready to be an EMT, that couldn't pass this minimum national registry. That's something that we really need to think about. And here's a trend. If we look at 2020, it was 71%. And I don't know why their process changed in 19, but we look down at the bottom here, it's 73%. And in 2018, it was 74%. We're actually having fewer people get trended out as far as passing these exams. So right now we're looking at 74%. That's 1 out of 4 essentially still never gets certified. And that is, to me, a startling number. And these are people coming into our paramedic schools. The concerns that people always bring up is, well, they would never be tested at an EMT level by the National Registry at a cognitive or psychomotor level. Well, that's somewhat true, and it's somewhat not true. First of all, the National Registry doesn't test the psychomotor at an EMT level anyway. The school does. And remember those lowest common denominator schools? They're going to get away with testing at a minimum level. So it's not always an absolute. I have students who come into my classes who are certified EMTs who cannot tell me the difference between an oral airway and a nasal pharyngeal because of the schools they went to. So these are things we have to think about. Those lowest common denominator students are still getting into your paramedic classes. From the cognitive level, why can't we just ask the EMT questions in the paramedic exam? Most of the paramedic exam, if you ask a lot of people, is EMT knowledge anyway. So that's part of what National Registry is working on. How do we assure that in a paramedic test, we're asking these lower level questions for the EMT level? And I think we can solve that. That really isn't a daunting problem. It's not something that's an obstacle to this process. So what did we do in Texas? We have some pilot programs, and we have a question. Let's see what the question is. From Katie's, many states, the EMT student is only required to observe in a clinical setting, so they're not gaining the interpersonal relationship experience already. I agree with you, Katie. That's 100% true in a lot of ways. We have, I think we overemphasize or kind of over expect what actually happens in EMT schools. We have a lot more observation. We have people say they didn't gain experience. Well, if their experience was 2 ambulance ride outs and 8 hours in the emergency room with their standing in the corner with their jaw on the floor, what did they learn? And can we not make that up in the paramedic experiences in clinical anyway? So absolutely think that's right on, Katie. That to me is kind of what drew me to we can do this better. And in reality, that's my thought here, is we can do this better. It's time to think about what we're doing. So as we look at what we've done in Texas, we took a few years, talked about some plans, finally decided we're going to test this. And we had 2 programs that were chosen to give it a try. Del Mar College down in Corpus Christi, Texas is very close to being done if they aren't already. And I was hoping, Rio, did Melissa get on?
I believe she is here.
Okay. So maybe Melissa Stuvey or Steve, I pronounce it the way it looks, it doesn't work right. She did the program down at Del Mar College. And if Melissa, are you available to talk? Can we make her live?
Sure.
Melissa, maybe she's not. All right, so I'm going to talk forward. If she can get on and interrupt me, that'd be fine too. So Del Mar's College at Corpus Christi trains the Corpus Christi Fire Department. So the fire department, nope, that's the wrong Melissa. We're looking for Melissa Steve and spell like.
Then she is not on yet. Sorry,
Okay.
There's 2 Melissas.
All right, good enough. Well, thank you, the other Melissa, for trying. So their program down in Corpus Christi trains the Corpus Christi Fire Department. Corpus Christi hired 25 students for this class, and they train them. In their process, they start and do EMT, immediately follow it with fire school, and then immediately follow it with paramedic school. And it takes 2 years to go through their program before they hit the streets as a firefighter paramedic. This was taught on an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday basis. It started in February. It should have finished in December. So we're waiting for the final results, and we've both been busy. We've talked, but we haven't really talked. So we're hoping that that program did well. I know when they did the EMT test, one of our agreements with the state was we would get them EMT certified, at least the National Registry, before they went to their field internship. And they did have 100% finish that process. The program I'm doing over in Weatherford College is a little more truly open enrollment. We had 14 students, all civilians. We did have 2 that were certified EMTs the day they walked in. We had 2 of them that were EMT students that became certified within the first week. So we ended up with 4 that were certified EMTs, and then we had 10 that had really no knowledge of EMS experience at all. In fact, a couple of them actually asked me what the difference between EMS and EMT was, so that tells you kind of where their limits are. We taught this on a C shift. So every 3rd day, if it was Monday through Friday, they came in, and we'll talk about whether that was good or bad later. We started this in May of 2021, and we will complete in 2022 in May this year, which I guess is just a few weeks away. And we have 9 students remaining in that program. To my knowledge, all 25 of the students who started the Corpus Christi department or program finished. Again, they were paid to be there, so they had a little bit different incentive than we did in Weatherford. Our outcomes, as we worked with the state, said, all right, what are we going to do to make sure this works? We said, well, why don't we hold them to the same paramedic outcome standards that we do for accreditation? So 70% retention, had to have 70% pass the National Registry paramedic exam, and 70% employment by 6 months. Now, I'm kind of really jealous about the Corpus Christi numbers because they're already employed. So they already met that. And retention, they are going to meet that because they're paying people to go to school. So these are things we have to think about. You're going to do this in your area, in your school. What are your numbers going to be? Now, overall, our expectation was that we wouldn't see any weakness in this whatsoever without the EMT certification, because we were going to cover all the areas in a paramedic school anyway. Now, I do know that Melissa's program down in Corpus Christi, they did put them through a couple of weeks of A&P and a week of midterm before they went through, but they usually did that with their students anyway. So that wasn't necessarily a change in their curriculum. So with our Weatherford class, again, we had the 14 students, and without Melissa here, I won't be able to give you the actual results from Corpus Christi. I can give you my personal ones. We did have that shift-based schedule every third day. We taught the exact same curriculum that we did for our traditional paramedic classes. So the reason we did, and this is something that's not good, I wouldn't recommend this for you, and I'm not going to do it again. We chose C shift because we had a B shift paramedic class, and I have one classroom. So I can't have class on top of each other, so that was the choice. So we taught the exact same shift schedule or same curriculum on the C shift schedule we did for our pilot students that we did on B shift for our traditional students. No difference in tests, hours of the program, no difference whatsoever. Right now, we're at 9 students in the program, so our retention is lower than I wanted it to be, but we learned a lot. We had 2 dropped because of the schedule. So when I say don't do a shift-based schedule for people who aren't on shifts, that's important. Their jobs, because they had other jobs, were hard to work in that shift-based schedule. We also had 1 student leave because he had a death in the family and couldn't continue in the program, which was sad to say. And then we had 2 who literally, as we were trying to fill 14 students to make the class, we kind of took everybody who applied and we didn't do enough assessments. We had 2 that were just academically not prepared to be there. And those really are the sad ones because they had dreams that they just weren't really prepared to have. So this gave us some lessons. We started thinking about, okay, what is the next concept? What are we going to do next? As I looked at grades for this class, we didn't see big differences. If I look at my previous paramedic class that had completed, they are the gold line. They're a little bit higher, but we're not talking 10 points higher. We're talking most of the time 2, maybe 3 points higher by final exam average. So for all these, I just looked at the average in the final exam. The EMT students in Texas EMTs are blue, so the blue line represents those that are EMTs. The red are those just going on to paramedic by itself, and they were really doing good. The last one, the EMS operations, this was actually not the final because they haven't taken that yet. So I expect it to actually bump up because usually that's the first test always gets their attention, then they start to study. When I'm looking at these, the students who are not EMTs actually were doing better than those that were EMTs through most of this program. And that was really kind of an interesting finding. Overall, we learned a few things. In the program side, it is very important that you have academic assessments to bring your students into the program. We have traditionally used EMT school as that academic assessment, and in reality, that's not going to be enough. You know, we always take EMTs into programs, and how many of those don't pass? So what are we going to use? We have to do other testing. A&P and medical terminology prerequisites really didn't seem to matter. And if it's covered in the class, if you're covering it in the program itself, and again, over time, I've made sure that any A&P that I needed to know, any medical terminology I needed to know, I covered in the program, because outside A&P and medical terminology were not cutting it from what the EMT students already had. Your schedule also needs to meet the needs of the students, not the program. And from our standpoint, we have 1 classroom. That's not the way to do it. Find a second classroom if you have to, or be really selective of who you put in the program. The students were the ones that were really surprising to me. And this was the things that I found very interesting. Some of the comments we got from our community when we started it was, great, it's a wonderful thing, but no one will hire somebody who's a certified paramedic who was never an EMT first. It was one of the things one of the comments we got was when these students go to clinicals, they'll only want to do the advanced skills. They won't want to do anything else. And really, we found it to be just the opposite. When I send my traditional paramedic students, remember, these are EMTs who are absolutely convinced the only difference between them and a paramedic is they can intubate, start IVs, and defibrillate. No concept that it's actually the knowledge. They just want the skills. So when these non-EMTs go to their clinical rotations, they focus on everything. Everything they do is new and exciting. When I listen to them come back from their clinical rotations, they tell me how cool it was that they got to talk to a patient and take a blood pressure, how cool it was to smell a GI bleed. When the other class comes back, they talk about, I only got to start 3 IVs. It was a waste of my time. And they don't think about the patients they experienced. We're also finding that these non-EMTs come to paramedic school with no bad habits. They have no preconceived ideas because their partner was going to try to teach them how to be a paramedic, and then I have to undo all that when they come to paramedic school. They take labs very seriously. They're really excited about those clinicals. They really get a good kick out of going into places that the paramedic students think are not worth their time because they've been an EMT and they think they know this stuff. And it's really kind of disappointing to listen to their comments about the clinicals compared to the other class. In internship, preceptors can't tell the difference, and I find that very interesting. And the people, and I didn't put this on the slide, but something to think about, you know, there are instructors in your program that will teach the EMT classes, but they won't teach the paramedic because the EMT students are always excited. Well, now we have paramedic students who are always excited. And some of my instructors who didn't like teaching paramedics because they didn't like their attitude are back teaching paramedics. And I found that to be a really interesting thing. Now, remember the comment that these people will never be able to find jobs because they weren't an EMT? We are still 6 or 7 weeks away from finishing, and 2 of them already have job offers. And we've got other people just looking at trying to see how they finish, ready to give them offers now. So overall, the students are doing really well in this process. There are still a few things that are going to require some work. States, and our state is in the process of it now, but we have to change rules. We have to change regulations and laws. We have to change some mindsets, and we have to change some traditions. It is okay to do this different. If your end result, if your community needs paramedics and EMT is a delay in that process, well, then train the paramedics. We met halfway through the programs at both Weatherford and at Corpus Christi. And we met with the Corpus Christi fire chief, who was so excited about this. He said, I don't care what the state says, we're doing this again. Remember, we did this on a waiver to do it without required EMT. The amount of money we're saving them 4 months in training is impressive. We're putting them on the streets 4 months earlier than we would have before. These are mindsets that we have to change to work. We do have to work with National Registry to create some paramedic examinations that assure the basic competencies, and that is in the works with National Registry. They're working on the process now. One of the things we also need to think about is this can work with EMT, it can work with, with paramedic, EMT not needing in the paramedic. We also don't need EMT going to AEMT. So that's the next step. Wouldn't that be a great thing? Just teach an AEMT course right from the start and put people on the streets a little bit sooner than we had before. So this would be a good time for more questions and comments. And I know there's some comments in the chat. I don't see any more questions in the questioning thing. But what do you see, Rio, that we need to kind of talk about or discuss? Or does anybody have any other questions that they want to pop up? So
See, there's another comment in the Q&A.
Okay, from Dustin. You have me considering this as a viable option after hearing your discussion. I wonder, though, if another area that needs to be addressed is the standards. Should we raise the basement of what is acceptable, make this a minimum of an associate degree? I think we definitely, I'm always for raising standards. I think we do them too low. And I'm glad to hear that I kind of convinced you at least a little bit. Be interesting to do the poll again and see if we're still 50-50 on this. I do think we need to think about where the standards are. I'm not finding that we really have a flaw in the standards as we see it now. Keep in mind, we've got 2 classes that we've piloted this with. I think it'd be fun, and I hope Texas is about to do a second round of this with a few other schools, a little bit bigger population, a little bit more diversity. So maybe we'll find that we have to raise that basement standard a little bit. I think we need to figure out what the achievement levels need to be to get into the program. I'll tell you, my fear is that we just take EMT away, and then a paramedic school that would traditionally have 20 students will just take 60 students because they don't have to be an EMT first. And they're not preparing those students in any way. And I think we have to make sure that students are ready to go. I found in our program that having a bachelor's degree wasn't always the requirement. We had one student who finished a bachelor's degree in a science-based curriculum whose grades were on the low end of normal, low end of passing. So that we thought he'd do really well, and he did okay. But we had other students without the bachelor's degree doing better than he did. So, you know, what is that academic standard? So it's a good question, Dustin. I just need to know, we need more information to actually answer that.
There was another question in the chat asking what prerequisites you required.
Well, I hate to say this. We were trying to fill the class, so the prerequisites were, did you sign up and pay the money? And that is absolutely not the right thing to do. We had a short window, but we were telling people we were going to do it, and we kind of had a mindset of when to do it. We knew when we wanted to start it. We were just waiting for the official okay from the state. By the time we got that, we had, I think, 2 months to fill a class. The day we got the permission, we sent out a Facebook notification we were going to do it. And by morning, we had over 900 comments. And it was kind of like what we saw today with the poll. 50% said we were going to kill EMS and that we should be, sent to prison. And the other 50% were, it was about time. From that, we thought we'd get a lot of students to fill our class with, but people were a little more leery. They wanted to see it tested before they signed up. So we ended up with essentially 10 brave volunteers. They were told, if you don't pass this class, you get nothing. Then they still came through, and I really want to give them a lot of credit for that. We had the other 4 that were already EMTs, so really didn't have anything to lose in that process. So I think that it's important to look at, and again, the history will tell us this. More studies will tell us this. What are those prerequisites? Because I think we really do need to find those prerequisites. So we've got a couple more questions. Just because NREMT changes what they're willing to do, they may not translate to states. I do agree that paramedic needs to be a minimum associate degree because paramedics are taking on new roles and those standards aren't covering traditional paramedic initial education. And I agree with that. I'm trying to figure out where the question is, but you're right. It isn't necessarily just National Registry. It is the states. The states have to accept this. And there are states, as I travel around as a site visitor for accreditation, I see states that say they have to have a certain number of months or years as an EMT before they even accept them into paramedic school. I've seen programs, I don't know if they're the state, but the program that says you have to have 500 calls before you can even apply to paramedic school. So when I talk about changes, we have to change standards. We have to change mindsets, and it's going to be more than just NREMT. But one state at a time, one group at a time, we start making progress and we start seeing what happens. We had another comment from Mike, actually 2 from Michael, I think. Take standards away from the states. States don't dictate nursing or doctor. Absolutely right. The standards need to be the national standards, and I kind of agree. We need to raise standards a little bit. And again, you're on this stuff. Volunteers will revolt in some areas. Well, we have to give them something to be happy with. And, maybe volunteer paramedics are difficult. But if we can make it easier for them to become AEMTs, maybe we've given a little bit. There's answers to these questions. We just have to be able to work through them. We have to do so with an open mind. When we say we've always done it, this is going to ruin stuff. It's not going to help us. Robert Walker asks, is there any ability for students to practice the skills in a modular sense? I've seen the students without a strong foundational education or experience, patient movement, struggle with the day-to-day operations as a paramedic. Absolutely. This is something that we kind of incorporated into both of our programs. And when I say we taught the same one, I've been planning on this for 5 years at least. Started changing thoughts in my initial education of the regular paramedic programs to try to do more of this, to make up for the difficulties in some of the EMT students that came in from some programs. So we've always done things to put more practice of skills. We really stress those EMT level skills in our paramedic programs. We tell them don't forget them. We still make them take blood pressures using that cuff that blows up with a little hand pump, not just a monitor. It drives them nuts, but in the end, they still know how to do that. So I think as you build the program, you look for those ways of enhancing those basic skills along with the advanced skills. So good question. And Lauren asked the question of our area has basically a paramedic shortage. That's hard to believe because I think as your area of the United States that's the problem. We're seeing that everywhere. Our service cannot compete with neighbors' pay. Absolutely. How would you solve retention after finishing and keeping paramedics from leaving your service or moving on to nursing? All right, I'm going to hit the last part first. Stopping them from going on to nursing, we're never going to do. And really, there ought to be a nice transition. As an older paramedic whose back's given out, whose knees don't work anymore, I can make more money in an air-conditioned, climate-controlled environment in the hospital. I think that's where people need to be. 40 years as a paramedic in the street is, well, I admire the people who can do it. So what's wrong with that transition? Moving too early, I think that's another fight, and I don't know how we do that. One of the things that we think may happen from this is that we can train locally because we bring people in locally. They may want to stay local. Money is always going to be a factor. I don't know that this is the solution to that side, but I think if we can bring people in from the community, if the fire department can host a paramedic class without having them to be EMTs first, maybe that at least keeps them in that service a little bit longer. And then Jeannie also asked the question, what is the plan to address the states? So I'm assuming you're talking about state rules and changes. I think those are going to come as National Registry has a plan and has an offer. You can take a test without being an EMT. Why wouldn't the states jump on that? I know early on when we discussed this with some states, they were all excited about it. I have had several people call me and say, hey, I hear about your program. I want to be in the next pilot, and they're not in my state. And I told them, well, you got to get your state involved. So that's part of what has to address next. We have to change the rules and laws. And that is going to take the states changing mindsets. So many medic courses have 50% pass rate. It's equivalent credits to associates. Colleges don't understand how someone can fail out. It needs a complete revamp. And yep, I agree. We have colleges that don't always have people passing programs the way they should, both at the classroom level and at the National Registry level. And we need to find ways to improve that. I'm not going to get into a discussion today whether associates is our best answer. It may be, it might not be. That's a different topic for someone else to get the stabs and the gunshot wounds from. There's a lot of talk that that's the direction it needs to go. So maybe so. And we got a comment from Charles. Who did you get the waiver from, NREMT or the state to run your program? So in Texas, we're not a National Registry state, so we didn't really need a waiver from National Registry. And the state of Texas gave a waiver to the two programs to not require EMT. So that we had to get it from our state. We were talking to National Registry the whole time. And National Registry's comment was that they would have to be an EMT before they took the paramedic test currently. Again, we are looking at how can we rewrite the test, at least one test, that allows them to come in just as paramedics. And that will happen, I'm pretty sure. It's just going to take a couple of years. And it's not like they're busy right now with the whole ALS redesign. So it's going to come. It may not be within the next year. So the waiver from the state was what we started with, and they were the ones that allowed us to do it. Whether or not that works for your state, that will be up to your state to determine. And as I mentioned, we did agree that they would have to take the NREMT EMT test before they started field internship. So they are taking both tests, but they are not necessarily getting certified in our state, which is saving them a little money and eventually will save a lot. So Katie asked the question, who is driving EMS at the moment? Are we catering to volunteer, fire, or EMS? I think once we figure out who we're doing this for, we would be able to move forward. This is more of the career-based paramedic, not for someone who just wants a license certificate for workforce needs. And that's a really good question. I think EMS who is driving it is state dependent. I found it very interesting the first time I went to Kansas and found out they required an associate degree in that state. And my first question was, what did the fire department say about that? And they said, why would the fire departments care? Apparently at the time, I can't speak of it today, but there was only one fire department based EMS system in Kansas. So they didn't have to worry about that. There was a lot of volunteer services, and those with paramedics still had to get the associate degree. So that's a good question. Who is driving it? And I think that's going to be state dependent. We do need to work together to make sure that we're just improving EMS, in my opinion. If anyone else has any comments on that, we can talk about that too. So Michael again asked that, or at least stated, I had a medic student put AED pads on the mannequin, clothing, and unable to get any breaths during the final exam. They said all the mannequins were naked and medics always have ET tubes. Yep. It's interesting what we think we taught them. And they sometimes never occurs to them to actually do something different. And this is something that I try to instill. I refer to it as the practice as you play policy, that you never do anything in practice that you wouldn't do in reality. And those are the things that really are tough to do. It's hard to get everybody in your system to kick up on that, which is interesting. You know, these are paramedic students who are still having some of these problems. It just tells us we have problems everywhere. So Katie had another question. We are not generating revenue like the hospital does. I can't go to McDonald's and tell the staff I will let my insurance take care of it, and then my insurance refuses to pay for the full service. Hospitals are able to gain much more than the Medicare negotiations, so that's the federal ordeal's not an education one. You bring up a really interesting topic, and it's something I've said for a long time, that we are our own worst enemies. We still allow the federal government to consider us to be ambulance drivers. We still are a provider of a service, not a medical provider, and that limits how we get funding. We have to start standing up and fighting for ourselves, and maybe this is part of that, but I really think that's a separate topic, but it's definitely a big one we need to discuss. And we have one from an anonymous attendee. How did this program affect your accreditation? And if students took this pilot class, are they eligible for NREMT so they can apply for reciprocity? 100% that they can do that. It affected our accreditation really in no way whatsoever. There's a part of the accreditation that actually says that you teach paramedic classes, and whether there's stop outs at the EMT or AEMT part is something you can kind of choose along the way. So we're teaching the exact same paramedic class to these pilot students. They're meeting all the same accreditation standards. And when they finish their NREMT, they are eligible for reciprocity into any state as a paramedic. Now, there is going to be the caveat, and this is something that's going to be an interesting question. If somebody has a state that, or a state law that absolutely says you had to be an EMT before you were a paramedic, and denies them of that, that's going to be an interesting topic. Right now, because of the way we think the compact is written, we don't think that is an issue. But that kind of remains to be seen. There may be a problem with that. We do know there's states, I know California has a problem sometimes with students who didn't get enough clinical hours or enough field experience hours, and it doesn't matter if they've had 2 years experience, they may have to get some other things caught up, and maybe that would be part of it. Now, technically, they were certified as an AE or as an EMT by National Register before they became a paramedic. So that may go away if we redo that test, and maybe that'll be an issue. So Michael again says we have students in medic degrees take EMT tests, then AEMT tests as checkpoints through the course. And, you know, those are good things to kind of do along the way. You know, it depends on how you break the course up. For the way our program is structured, they really wouldn't be certified as an EMT or an AEMT. They finish all of the paramedic class except field internship, because that's when they complete all the didactic information. But your program could set it up to kind of test basic level information, test the advanced information, and then test the paramedic information. And that would be a good thing. So another comment from Katie. Sorry, that was reply. Oh, sorry, never mind. I shouldn't read Katie's, but I'll read Scott's. Thank you for the presentation. I believe that it makes sense to have a pathway like this. And yes, it would have to include changes to our programs, but that seems to me to be the opportunity, not a barrier. And Scott, that's a great way to look at that. This is not a barrier to what we do. It's an opportunity to do something next. It's an opportunity to push our program a little bit farther ahead, to actually look at where we want to be and where we want to go. As I've mentioned, no other medical entity requires an early class before you take it. Don't have to be a PA before you're a doctor. Why can't we train to the end product? And I think we're finding that we can. Got a little bit more work to do in studying this process out. We have to make sure that we vet the students properly. And I think that's one thing we can pretty much sure that nursing schools and medical schools do. They vet very well, and we're going to have to do that as well. So that looks like all of our questions. Did we have anything else in the chat or anything, Rio, that we can look at?
I don't think there were any more questions. It's just a very lively discussion going on in here, which is great.
Good. Well, and that's good. The chat's a good place for you guys to talk amongst yourself and decide you can burn me in effigy or whatever. Because it's an interesting thing. I'd almost like to redo the poll and see if we're still at 50-50 on, do you think we should be doing this? Because I know there's people who I have not changed your mind. And there's other people who said, oh, wow, yeah, we can do this. Great. You know, remember back in 1970, no one thought we could do paramedic, and look what we've done. So we can do this better. And that's really the whole goal. So again, thanks for your time today. If you have any questions or want to talk to me specifically about this, this is my contact information. You can give me a phone call in my office there at the Weatherford College, or you can send me an email. I have 2 email addresses for you to pick from. The one that I'm usually answering on weekends is my non-work number, mostly because I try not to work on weekends. That's just kind of the way I am. And other than that, I guess we're kind of done. We're pretty close to being on time, are we not?
We are. We definitely are. And
Okay.
Katie said, thank you for this. I have been waiting for someone to finally be progressive in making the change. It starts with the roots education.
And you're right. And I want to tell you that this was not me. I'm the one that seems to get pushed up in the forefront of you go talk. I think they figure it's kind of like nuclear radiation. I'm old, so it doesn't matter what happens to me. But there've been a team of people all across this country that have decided it's time to do something different. And I'm really kind of happy to talk about it as the, I guess, the public spokesman, or maybe the spokespig. But I'm really excited about the other people who are behind the scenes that are wanting to do this as well. When we introduced it in Texas, we had several programs willing to give it a try. we decided to go with the 2 just to start and see what happens. We're 7 hours apart in distance. We had 2 different models. I think it worked well. Now is the step of, can we get more programs in Texas to do it? And there are other states that maybe want to try it too, that could find a way to make this work. So I know Joe Schmieder with the state of Texas is willing to talk to other state directors. Obviously, I would be willing to engage any conversations with any of those states that would like to do so. And I really just appreciate all the help we're getting from all across the nation. And just thank you for your time today and for putting up with me. And Kate, is there a way to get involved? Call your state and call my state, and we'll do anything we can to help you get involved in this process at whatever level we need to do.